Okay, welcome to the very first still to be titled interview series on the Psychology of Emerging Adulthood Research Lab's YouTube channel. We're joined today by none other than Dr. Abby Goldstein. Okay, Abby, for those who don't know you and are watching, you wear a lot of different hats. Let's kick things off by seeing if you know all the different hats you wear.
Okay. So I am an associate professor in the Department of Applied Psychology and Human Development at OISE at the University of Toronto, and I'm also the associate chair of that department. I'm a Canada Research Chair in the Psychology of Emerging Adulthood, and I lead the Psychology of Emerging Adulthood Research Lab at OISE. I'm also a course instructor, so I teach our many master's students and doctoral students and supervise those students in our program. And I am a researcher who's involved in a number of different projects involving emerging adulthood. And I'm a clinical psychologist, and I do some private practice on the side.
Right. Not to mention a human and a
And a
parent.
human. Yes.
So how do you do it all?
I try to bring sort of some of the same qualities across all of those roles. So I think when I think about, what do I need to do in order to engage with those different aspects of my work, I think it's important to be present, to be curious. That's really something that runs through everything that I do, to be compassionate and engaged, and truly sort of interested in other people's experiences. And that's important for all of the various roles that I take in my work life and in my home life too.
And so which hat are you wearing most often right now?
There's a lot of administrative work has been coming my way as associate chair of the department because of COVID and all of the ways in which that's sort of changing the work that we do within the department. But I am teaching a course right now, which I truly love. I teach a course in addictions, and I look forward to teaching Thursday nights, and it's been such an enjoyable thing. And I have to say, the transition to teaching online, I think, has gone relatively well. And I hope and I feel as though my students are still quite engaged. So that takes up a good chunk of my week too. And that parent piece, that's something I'm doing all of the time. And especially now that I'm working from home, I'm home a lot more often with my kids, which has been a blessing in many ways.
All right, let's shift over to emerging adulthood and start off with a bit of a refresher. So for those who don't know, what is emerging adulthood?
Emerging adulthood really refers to the time of life that occurs between adolescence and sort of, more solidly adulthood, young adulthood or adulthood. And it's a time that's characterized by a number of different things, but it involves a focus on identity. So there's a focus on exploring one's identity and figuring out who they are and sort of what's their sort of purpose and role in the world. There's a focus on the self. It's a time where many emerging adults don't necessarily have responsibility for other people, and so there's more opportunity for introspection. It's also a time of exploration and possibility and optimism, the sense that sort of there's so much that the world has to offer, and being at the beginning of adulthood allows one to explore all of those things and sort of feel optimistic about what's possible for the future. It can also be a time of instability. So emerging adults are oftentimes moving in and out of various roles. They may be in school and then out of school and back in again. They may be in various jobs. They may be living in different places and moving from place to place. They may be in relationships that, sometimes are more permanent, but other times are much more transient. And so there's a lot of instability associated with this time of life. And it's also a time where emerging adults feel in between. They're sort of not quite adolescents, but also not yet adults. And so that in-betweenness can be challenging in some ways, and it also can be liberating in some ways.
So you mentioned young adulthood. What's the difference between emerging adulthood and young adulthood?
Emerging adulthood is really more about sort of that transitional period that occurs between adolescence and young adulthood. So it's really more about sort of finding an individual finding their footing and sort of taking their place in terms of understanding where their future will go with respect to education and career and family and relationships. And so as I said, in terms of that period of instability, there's a lot of change happening in this time of life. And young adulthood is sort of a little bit more when people have found their footing to a greater degree and feel that there's a bit more permanence in some of the roles that they're taking on. Like they may have a job that's going to last a longer period of time, or be in a relationship where there's commitment and there's a sense that it will be a longer relationship.
Now, some researchers in the field say that emerging adulthood encompasses the ages 18 to 25, while others say 18 to 29. So what's up with that?
Yeah. I think in some ways it sort of depends on the emerging adult. I think that when we consider taking on adult roles, that can happen at different ages for different people. I think by expanding the definition, so extending it up to 29, there's more of an opportunity to really consider the fact that many people do take longer to find their footing and to move into those adult roles. And so that allows a greater opportunity to really understand what's happening for that longer period of transition. But in some ways, I think it's less about the sort of age, that it's not a time of life that's necessarily defined by chronological age, and really more about the experience and the process that's happening during this time of life. And that as individuals are continuing to experience the characteristics that emerging adulthood is about, then that means they're still emerging adults.
So less about the biological age, more about those transitional experiences that define that period.
Exactly.
And so how did you get interested in emerging adulthood?
My research really started in the field of addictions. So early on in my career, I focused a lot on understanding university or college student drinking and binge drinking and some of the risks that were associated with alcohol use, and also cannabis use and other risk behaviors. And because substance use is very prevalent among emerging adults, it led me to really look at a little bit more about what's happening during this developmental time that may be contributing to some of the risks and challenges that individuals are undergoing. And from there, I sort of broadened my perspective and tried to really look more closely at what were the unique features of this time of life that contributed to risk behaviors, and also what contributed to wellness behaviors and well-being during this time of life. So broadening the focus from just risk to also wellness and well-being, because that's such an important piece of how we can promote resilience and adjustment during emerging adulthood.
What's a common misconception people have about emerging adults?
So one of the topics that has been sort of played out in the literature a little bit is this idea that emerging adults were representative of a sort of a me time of life, that it was a time of selfishness. And we do know that there is a period of self-focus that coincides with emerging adulthood. But in fact, as far as the sort of considerations of other people, emerging adults are very concerned for the welfare of others. So we know that emerging adults are extremely civic-minded. They can be highly politically engaged. They're concerned about social justice. So emerging adults are really a group of people who have a lot of concern for others and for the future of our society and of our planet. And so I think that is a misconception that really hasn't played out. This idea that it's a selfish time. Oftentimes, it really is a time of focusing on others and helping to promote wellness and health and prosperity in the world.
So that brings us to now during COVID, where a lot of recent media attention has focused on how emerging adulthood behavior is making them the largest population drivers for COVID, especially in Ontario, but also in other parts of the world. So what's going on there? How do you make sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think early on there wasn't a lot of attention to messaging that was being put forward to help emerging adults manage this particularly difficult time. And I think this is true for all ages, where the requirements around social distancing or the advice around social distancing and the requirements to really stay away from other people is something that struck emerging adults as particularly problematic, because this is such an important time in terms of social relationships and connection. And when we think about some of the transitions that happen during emerging adulthood, for example, going to college or university, those experiences are very much tied to social engagement. And so it's particularly challenging for emerging adults to sort of uphold the social distancing that's required of us to ensure the safety of us and others. And yet it's an important piece. So I think one of the areas where we haven't done very well is developing messaging that could really speak to what emerging adults' needs are, and provide recommendations about ways that they can pursue what is important for them developmentally, while also continuing to engage in social distancing.
And so what would be one piece of advice that you would give to emerging adults during COVID?
Yeah, I think, I think in some ways it requires a lot of creativity. So I think part of the advice would be, how can we work with emerging adults, and how can emerging adults work together to come up with some creative ideas that continue to promote engagement and socialization and connection, but don't do that in person. And it's not an easy task, because it definitely is different from anything we've ever had to do before. But I think a lot of the things that happen in person could probably happen online too. It's just about being creative with how that can look.
And what about parents of emerging adults? If you could give one piece of advice to them, what would it be?
Well, I think a lot of it is about sort of understanding and compassion, the same things I mentioned earlier on, and just recognizing that this is a particularly difficult situation for emerging adults to be in. Emerging adults are at a time in life where autonomy and independence is so important for their development. And many of them are finding themselves at home with parents for longer periods of time than they had anticipated. And so that's going to bring up challenges and ones that were not anticipated. But it's a good opportunity in some ways to sort of renegotiate roles at home. So looking a little bit more closely about how is the communication between parents and emerging adults? Are there ways that communication can be improved? And how can parents sort of recognize their emerging adults' need for autonomy and independence, while also ensuring that there's respect for others in the house, and that individuals within the house are all contributing to the workings of that household. I also think it's a particularly helpful or good time to come together. Things we've heard from emerging adults that we've asked about at this time, and they've commented on, they've spent more time with their parents, they've discovered shared interests that they didn't know they've had. They've watched sort of Netflix shows together that they didn't think that they would both like. And so in many ways, this time has actually brought people together. But those conversations about how they can come together need to happen in order for that to work well.
Let's take this opportunity to plug a few of the studies that we have going on in the lab. So if you could just talk a little bit about what we're doing, that would be great.
Sure. So one of our studies has a few components, but it's really a study that looks at the relationship between parents and their emerging adult children, and how different aspects of that relationship contribute to the emerging adults' wellness and well-being, and some of the risk behaviors they're involved with, and also what that relationship looks like as the emerging adult transitions during the course of emerging adulthood. So we're doing a longitudinal study, and we're tracking emerging adults once a year for 3 years, and asking them to fill out a daily survey for 30 days within each of those time points. So they're telling us each day how was their relationship with their parents that day, what kinds of communication happened with their parent, and also telling us some of the different activities they're involved with that day, both looking at risk behaviors like alcohol use and cannabis use, and also wellness behaviors, ways in which they're sort of engaging in self-care. And we're looking at sort of well-being and mental health, and how those things evolve over the course of emerging adulthood as a function of the parent-child relationship. We're also doing a separate piece to that study where we're trying to understand a bit better what are the most effective ways that emerging adults and their parents can communicate about challenging issues, so we can support them in those conversations and develop some interventions that really focus on parents and how they may improve some of the ways in which they communicate with their kids in order to encourage healthy and productive conversations.
All right. Yeah, go on. We've got more. We've got more going on.
Yes, I was going to plug one more, which is one of my doctoral students has just started a really interesting study looking at single session motivational interviewing for cannabis use. So looking at emerging adults who are struggling with heavier cannabis use and wanting to reduce their use, and developing an intervention to support them in reducing their cannabis use. And one last study that we're just starting now is looking a little bit more at some of the policies that exist within the university context that may support or hinder some of the ways in which emerging adults with mental health issues experience university. So trying to understand to what extent policies help keep emerging adults with mental health challenges engaged in courses, or may contribute to them becoming disengaged and sort of contributing to some of the attrition that we see with those who are struggling with mental health issues in university contexts.
And if people want to find out more about these studies and more about our lab and who's involved in them, They can check out our website, and a link to that is below in the title section, as well as to our Instagram and our Twitter, and also to Abby's various profiles online. So be sure to check out those links. We're going to shift over to the rapid fire portion of the interview, where I ask you a series of quick questions. You ready?
Okay, I'm ready.
All right. Number one, what's the first place in the world you want to visit after COVID?
Italy.
Okay. Number two, what is your favorite restaurant in Toronto?
Rasa.
Number three, if I didn't have blank, I don't know how I'd get through the day.
Coffee.
Right back at you. Okay. Number four, astrology is blank.
Not for me.
What's your sign?
Sagittarius.
Classic Sagittarius response.
Of course.
If you hadn't become a clinical psychologist and are wearing all those hats, what would you be doing?
When I was younger, I wanted to be a journalist or an author. And I think one of the things I didn't mention as part of the hats that I wear is writing, which I truly enjoy writing. It's not always easy to make time to do it, but I enjoy it. I love reading. I love telling stories. So I think that would have been the other thing I do. I would at least have tried to maybe been a writer, been an author of some kind.
Okay, you are evidence that there are people out there who enjoy writing.
Yes, I am.
Okay. What are you grateful for right now?
Well-being. That's, I think, each day that's what I think about most in terms of, I feel so privileged to spend time with them, and in ways that, to be honest, I haven't really been able to before, because usually my work takes me outside of my house most of the time. So I'm grateful to have, this time be about spending more time with them.
The video cut out for a second. I'm going to assume you were talking about your family.
I was, yes.
Okay. All right. And what's the last thing you watched and loved?
Oh gosh. Wait, I watched it and I loved it. Like both of those things.
You enjoyed it.
I've watched so many things lately. It's hard for me to think of just one.
A lot of content.
A lot of content. I watched Normal People, and I really, really liked it. I had read the book, and I thought it was a fantastic book, and I thought the series was excellent. Very, very well done.
Both are so good. Everyone, go read and watch Normal People.
Yeah.
Something people don't know about you is?
There's not a lot. I don't think there's a lot about me that people don't know. Well, this is something people know, but I think it's sort of something that's very typical of me, which is that I am absolutely a morning person, and I get up very early, and I love that time in the morning. I love that hour before other people are awake that I just have to myself.
Now, you just said an hour before other people are awake, but for those who don't know, what time are you talking about waking up?
I'm 5 o'clock in the morning. It's my favorite time of day.
Okay. All right. And then last but not least, if you could pick one or two adjectives to describe yourself as an emerging adult, what would they be?
Cautious. And curious.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Excellent. Abby, thank you so much for your time, for doing this, for your answers. And like I said before, if people want to learn more about our lab, all the information is below. Abby, thank you. Good luck with what I'm sure is a day full of meetings.
Yes.
And I'll see you at a lab meeting soon.
Okay. Thanks so much, Daniel.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye.